Whipped like Mama was, sobbed the orphan girl as the leather snapped across her back. She fell to the dirt, clutching her threadbare dress, her cry swallowed by the merciless sky. But fate had a witness that day, a rancher who'd sworn his land would never know cruelty again, and his next words would change her life forever. The sun burned low over the dry plain, not yet set but already cruel. The air shimmered hot, and the only sound above the cicadas was the crack of a whip tearing through the silence. A little girl, no more than 9, stumbled in the dust, her knees bloodied, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her name was Clara, though no one in town bothered with it. They called her the stray or the beggar, like she was less than a child. Only when she cried out did she remind them she was flesh and blood, a soul who remembered what it meant to be loved. Whipped like Mama was, she choked through trembling lips, curling in on herself as if her small arms could shield her from the lash. But nothing shielded her, not from the widow who raised her out of bitterness, nor from the eyes of the townsfolk who turned away. Clara's mother had died years earlier, worked to death on another man's farm, her back marked the same way, her cries forgotten in the dust. And now it seemed history was carving the same scars into her daughter's skin. At the edge of the street, reins pulled taut, a rider sat frozen. He was a broad-shouldered man with weather in his face and years in his eyes. His name was Amos Calder, a rancher whose land stretched quiet along the ridge just past the river. Amos hadn't come into town for company, he never did. He came for salt, flour, maybe nails, then left. He didn't like to linger where gossip hung heavier than the air. But today his horse stilled on its own, nostrils flaring at the sound of the lash. Amos's jaw locked. He had heard that sound before, on battlefields where cruelty was called discipline, in barns where desperate men broke horses like they broke children, and once, years ago, on his own ranch, when he had been too far away to stop a cruel hand from lashing a boy hired to muck stables. Amos had sworn that day his land would never echo with that sound again. Never. "Enough," Amos muttered under his breath, though the woman holding the whip didn't hear him. He swung from his saddle, boots hitting the ground hard. His spurs clinked once against the packed earth, and the street seemed to grow quieter with each step he took. Clara didn't see him at first. Her world had shrunk to dust and pain and the memory of her mother's broken body. But when a shadow fell over her, broad, unyielding, she dared to lift her head. Through blurred eyes she saw him, the rancher. A man with a weathered face, a beard dusted with gray, and eyes that didn't look away from her as everyone else had. Amos Calder planted himself between the child and the whip. The widow's arm froze mid-swing, her sharp mouth curling with outrage. "This is no affair of yours," she spat. "She's mine to discipline." "She's a child," Amos said, his voice low, iron steady, "and I won't see her beaten again." The air bristled. The crowd that had gathered shifted uncomfortably. Some wanted to protest, but none dared speak against Amos. They knew his strength, his silence, his reputation as a man who did not bend once he set his stance. The widow sneered, lowering the whip but not her glare. "Then you take her, you feed her, you keep her from turning wild, but don't bring her back when she ruins you too." She spat in the dust and stalked away, muttering curses not fit for the ears of heaven. The whip clattered to the ground between them. Clara flinched at the sound, curling tighter against the dirt, as if even discarded leather still held power over her. Amos bent slowly, carefully, his shadow covering her like a shield. His hand didn't reach for her at first. Instead, he pressed it flat against the earth, steady and patient, letting her see it wasn't a threat. "Little one," he said, voice softened in a way that surprised even him, "you'll only know kindness here." Clara's sobs shook her small frame. She wanted to believe him, needed to, but trust was something torn from her piece by piece, like skin under the lash. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Amos reached for his kerchief, rough and worn from years of use, and laid it gently over her shoulders. "Come on," he murmured. "Storm's past. You're safe now." The girl blinked up at him. For the first time she saw not just a man but a promise, a refuge. Slowly, trembling, she placed her tiny, scraped hand in his. The crowd whispered. No one stopped him as Amos lifted her carefully into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a broken bird. His horse pawed at the dirt, eager to be gone. Amos swung into the saddle with the girl cradled against his chest, and with one look back at the silent street, he rode out. But as the town fell behind, Amos knew this was not the end of her suffering. The land was wide and cruel, and men had long memories for the vulnerable. Taking her in meant making enemies. And Amos Calder had made enough enemies already to know this was only the beginning. The horses' hooves struck the hard-packed trail, their rhythm steady against the hush that had fallen over the valley. Amos Calder held the child tight against his chest, feeling her shiver through layers of dust, fear, and thin fabric. Clara didn't fight him. She was too weak, too raw from the lashing. Yet her small fingers clenched the front of his coat as if she feared he might set her down and leave her as the world so often had. Amos said nothing. His silence wasn't cold. It was deliberate, a silence born of a man who knew words meant less than action. The trail stretched long, each mile marked not by landmarks but by the child's ragged breaths. Her head rested against his shoulder, and though she didn't speak, Amos could feel the way her body remained taut, braced as if she expected another strike at any moment. He tightened his grip slightly, enough to remind her she was secure, not bound. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with shades of fire that bled into purple. When his ranch finally came into view, it was nothing grand, just a small cabin standing firm against the endless sprawl of land. A weathered barn leaned slightly with age. Fences snaked along the pasture and smoke curled gently from the chimney, carrying the smell of wood and ash. It wasn't much to outsiders, but to Amos it was all that was left of his bloodline, all that kept him rooted. He reined his horse at the gate, dismounted with careful precision, and adjusted Clara in his arms. The child's eyes darted wide at the cabin as though she couldn't quite believe she was being carried toward shelter rather than away from it. He crossed the yard, boots crunching against gravel, and shouldered the door open. Inside, the warmth of the hearth greeted them. Amos set her down gently on a chair near the fire. Clara flinched, her hands rising to shield her face, expecting perhaps that even kindness came with a price. Amos knelt, steadying her trembling shoulders. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and certain. "This roof doesn't allow harm, not while I draw breath." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, tears welled again, streaking down her dust-covered cheeks. Amos stood, moved to a shelf, and returned with a bowl and pitcher of water. He soaked a cloth and handed it to her, but when she hesitated, he crouched again, carefully dabbing at the grime on her face. She winced, but he didn't stop. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful, deliberate. By the time he finished, the little girl's face emerged from beneath the dirt, revealing eyes too old for her years. They were wide, fragile but fierce beneath the pain, carrying the same fire he had once seen in soldiers who had lost everything yet still stood. Amos drew back, studying her. "What's your name, child?" he asked. She swallowed hard, her voice cracked, thin and broken. "Clara." "Clara," Amos repeated, nodding slowly as if etching it into stone. "You'll carry that name here without shame. No one will take it from you." Her small frame shook at his words, the promise sounding like a prayer she hadn't known could be spoken aloud. For so long she had been stray, beggar, or nuisance. Her true name had been stripped from her lips, but Amos gave it back as if it was sacred. He rose, fetched bread from the cupboard, hard with age but filling, and set it before her. Clara hesitated, staring at the food as though it were a trick, but hunger clawed through her doubt. She tore into it, chewing as tears spilled freely again. Each bite was not just bread but survival, and each swallow reminded her body that life hadn't abandoned her completely. Amos didn't rush her, didn't hover. He only sat across the table, watching with an expression caught between grief and quiet resolve. As the fire crackled, shadows stretched across the cabin walls. Clara's head began to dip, her exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. Amos moved to lift her again, carrying her to the small cot tucked in the corner. He laid her down, covering her with a quilt stitched long ago by hands that no longer lived. She curled into it instinctively, her tiny fists loosening for the first time since he had found her. Amos lingered by her side for a long while. In her face he saw not only a child broken by cruelty, but also a mirror of the promises he had failed to keep in his own life. His wife had passed years before, and with her, the dream of filling this cabin with laughter and footsteps. Now here lay a child who bore scars of her own, asking without words for something he wasn't sure he had left to give. But Amos Calder was not a man who turned from a vow once spoken. "Only kindness," he whispered again, though she was already lost to sleep. The night deepened and Amos sat by the fire, his rifle leaning close by. He didn't sleep. His mind turned not just to Clara but to the widow who had raised her with cruelty, and to the town that had allowed it. A reckoning stirred in his chest, the kind that didn't come with fists or bullets but with something stronger, defiance against a world that turned its eyes from suffering. By dawn, Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, blinking against the gray light filtering through the shutters. She sat up quickly, panic flashing across her face as if waking meant the nightmare would begin again. But instead she found Amos seated at the table, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the steady rhythm oddly comforting. He looked up and gave a nod, not stern, not soft, simply steady. "Morning," he said. Clara clutched the quilt around her. She opened her mouth, but her voice faltered. At last she whispered, "Do I stay here?" Amos met her gaze. "You stay as long as you need, Clara. No one takes you from this house unless you want to go." Her lips trembled, disbelief fighting hope. She pressed her face into the quilt, muffling the sob that followed. Amos turned his eyes back to the knife, not because he was indifferent, but because giving her privacy was its own form of respect. Later he showed her the ranch. The horses, restless in the corral, snorted clouds into the morning air. The chickens clucked noisily, eager for feed. Clara stood timidly beside him, still clinging to the quilt like a shield. He handed her a bucket, heavy for her small arms, but he steadied her grip. "They'll peck if you drop it," he warned gently, then paused. "But they won't bite." Clara nodded, determined despite the trembling in her hands. She scattered grain with clumsy movements, laughing nervously when the chickens flocked around her. Amos allowed himself the smallest smile at the sight. A sound he had not heard in his home for years had just returned. But peace on the frontier was fragile, always waiting for the wrong breath of wind to scatter it. By midday, a rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the sun. Amos's hand went to his rifle out of habit. Clara stiffened, retreating instinctively behind him. The rider descended slowly, confidently, and when his face came into view, Amos recognized him. It was Sheriff Hale, a man bound by duty but too often tied to the whispers of those with influence in town. The sheriff drew his horse to a halt at the fence line, his expression unreadable. "Amos," he called, tipping his hat, "word's come that you took the Wren girl." Clara froze at the sound of her old surname, her nails digging into Amos's coat. Amos's voice was calm, but his jaw was set like stone. "She's here," he said simply. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "The widow claims you stole her property, says the girl owes labor." Amos stepped forward, his broad frame casting a shield over Clara. "She's no property, she's a child, and she's under my roof now." The sheriff's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Amos. "Careful, Calder, this'll stir more than dust. You keep her, you'll be crossing folk who don't forgive easy." Amos's grip tightened on the rifle at his side, though he kept it lowered. "Let them cross me then, but they won't cross her again." The sheriff lingered a moment, his horse stamping nervously. Finally, he nodded once, a slow acknowledgement, and turned his mount back toward town. But his parting words carried on the wind, heavy as the storm they promised. "You've started something, Amos. Best be ready to finish it." Clara's wide eyes lifted to him, fear clashing with desperate hope. Amos placed a hand gently on her head, steadying her trembling. "Don't fear him, Clara," he murmured. "Fear had enough of you, it ends here." But in his chest, Amos knew the battle had only just begun. The sheriff's warning hung heavy in the air long after the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the distance. Amos Calder stood at the fence line, his hand still resting on the wood rail, his gaze locked on the horizon. Clara clung to his coat, silent but trembling, her wide eyes searching his face for answers. Amos didn't speak at first. He had learned long ago that words said in anger or fear could carve wounds deeper than any lash. Instead, he knelt so his face was level with hers. "You listen to me, Clara," he said, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of an oath. "What happened back there? That was men trying to tell me you belong to them, but they're wrong. You're no one's but God's, and while you're here you'll never be whipped again. Do you understand?" Her lips quivered and tears welled again, but she nodded. She wanted to believe. Amos placed a hand gently against her back, feeling the welts beneath the fabric of her dress. The pain of them burned through his palm as though it were his own flesh. He drew in a slow breath, forcing down the fire in his chest. Inside the cabin, Amos set her back at the table and pulled down a small box from the top shelf. Clara watched warily as he opened it, revealing strips of clean cloth, a jar of salve, and a needle and thread. It was a soldier's kit, one he had kept long after his days of service were done, not because he wanted to remember those years, but because scars always returned on new bodies. "This'll sting some," he said, dipping a cloth into the salve. He didn't force her. He waited until she nodded barely before gently lifting the torn fabric at her shoulders. Clara flinched, the memory of the whip making her body twist, but Amos's touch stayed steady, careful. Slowly, he pressed the salve into the cuts, his large hands moving with surprising tenderness. She winced, tears slipping down her cheeks, but when she dared to open her eyes, she found him watching, not with pity but with something stronger. Respect, as if her endurance was something sacred. When the wounds were bound and the salve had dulled the sting, Amos leaned back. "There," he murmured. "You'll heal. Scars may stay, but they'll never define you. Not here." Clara pulled the quilt around her again, pressing her face into the fabric to hide the sob that escaped. Amos sat back, letting her cry. He didn't reach for her this time, knowing sometimes the only way to heal was to let the storm pass through. The following days brought a fragile rhythm. Clara followed Amos like a shadow, small feet padding after him as he worked the ranch. She fetched water with a bucket too heavy for her arms, scattered grain for the chickens with hands that shook, and carried wood that nearly toppled her with each step. But each task Amos gave her carried no lash, no scolding, only the quiet instruction of a man who had once taught colts to trust his hand. "Don't grip the bucket by the rim," he said one morning, his voice rumbling low. "Hands beneath, stronger that way." She obeyed, and when the water sloshed over her dress, she panicked, bracing for rebuke. Instead, Amos only chuckled once softly, shaking his head. "Water dries, Clara, nothing more." Her breath caught, and for the first time, a small, hesitant smile tugged at her lips. It was fleeting, like a bird afraid to linger, but Amos saw it, and he carried that small flicker in his chest like a lantern in the dark. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. By the third day, Amos noticed smoke rising in the distance, thicker than any hearth should burn. He led Clara back inside, bolting the door as shadows stretched long across the fields. He knew what was coming. Word had already spread in town that he had defied the widow, had taken in a girl she claimed as her own. Men like that didn't let things rest. Sure enough, that night, the sound of hooves thundered against the earth. Clara startled, her small hands clutching Amos's arm as if her fingers could root her to safety. Amos rose, taking down the rifle from above the door. He loaded it with calm precision, not rushing, not trembling. The lantern on the table flickered, casting his shadow tall against the wall. The riders stopped outside, their laughter carrying sharp through the night air. Voices barked threats, curses, accusations. Send her out, Calder. She ain't yours to keep. Clara whimpered, hiding behind the table, her body curling into the quilt. Amos stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his presence filling the doorway. The night air bit cold, but the fire in his eyes burned hotter than any wind. She's a child, Amos called, his voice carrying across the yard. No man of honor raises a hand against one. If you've come to test me, then know this: cross that fence and you'll answer to me. Silence followed, broken only by the restless shifting of horses. The men hadn't expected resistance, not from Amos, who kept to himself. They muttered among themselves, then one spat into the dirt. "This ain't over," he growled. The riders wheeled their horses, galloping back toward the ridge. Amos stood long after they vanished, his rifle still raised, his eyes searching the dark. When he finally lowered it, he turned back inside. Clara was crouched on the floor, her face buried against her knees. He set the rifle aside and crouched beside her. "They won't touch you," he said, his voice softer now. "Not while I'm standing." Her tear-streaked face lifted, eyes searching his as if trying to measure the truth in them. "They'll hurt you," she whispered. Amos paused, then shook his head. "I've taken worse, but no one lays a hand on you again." She flung herself forward, wrapping her thin arms around his neck, clinging like she feared he would vanish if she let go. Amos's arms closed around her, strong and sure, his chin resting atop her tangled hair. For the first time in years, he let someone that close, let himself feel the weight of another's trust. Morning broke with a silence that was not peace but warning. Amos knew the riders would return, and not alone. But he also knew something else. The moment Clara had clung to him, he had made his choice. This fight wasn't about land or pride. It was about a child who had been whipped, like her mother before her, and a promise that cruelty would not be the final word over her life. He saddled his horse at dawn, rifle slung across his back, Clara standing barefoot in the frost watching him. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice breaking. He knelt, brushing a hand gently against her cheek. "Not leaving," he said. "I'm going to town. Best way to end trouble is to face it head on." Fear struck her face, her small hands clutching his sleeve. "Don't let them take me." He clasped her hand tight, pressing her knuckles against his chest. "They won't, Clara, not while I breathe." She nodded, but tears glistened in her eyes as he mounted and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Alone at the fence, Clara stood trembling, her heart pounding with a fear too big for her small frame. She whispered into the wind, the words half prayer, half plea. "Please, God, don't take him from me too." The trail into town was quiet, too quiet for Amos Calder's liking. He rode with his shoulders squared, his rifle resting against his thigh, and the kind of silence that carried its own warning. Every crunch of hoof against the frostbitten earth echoed like a reminder. The fight wasn't waiting for him. It was already here. The ridges loomed, the air thin, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed on his chest as firmly as the child's frightened plea had that morning. Clara's whisper still rang in his ears. "Please, God, don't take him from me too." Amos clenched the reins tighter. He had seen too many prayers go unanswered in this hard country, but he would be damned if hers went unheard. He had given her his word. He intended to keep it. When the town's roofs rose in the distance, smoke curling from chimneys and the faint sound of a blacksmith's hammer carrying on the wind, Amos slowed his horse. He knew the streets he was riding into would not greet him kindly. Whispers already ran through the saloon, the mercantile, the church steps. He had taken in the Wren girl, had crossed the widow, had defied the quiet order that kept cruelty hidden beneath polite smiles. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, tying his horse with deliberate care. Each motion was slow, steady, showing no fear. The boardwalk creaked beneath his boots as he climbed the steps. Sheriff Hale was waiting, his hat pulled low, his face shadowed with the weariness of a man pulled between law and men who believed themselves above it. "Calder," the sheriff said, his voice even, "you come to talk or to start trouble?" Amos met his gaze without flinching. "I came to end it." The sheriff leaned back against the post, arms crossed. "That girl, the widow, claims she's bound by labor debt, says she owes her keep." "She's 9 years old," Amos cut in, his voice sharp. "A child don't owe debt, not to a woman who raised her with a whip instead of bread." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I don't disagree, Amos, but the widow's got men on her side. They'll say you stole what wasn't yours." Amos stepped closer, his shadow falling across the sheriff's boots. "Then let them say it. I didn't steal her. I saved her. And if those men think to come riding on my land, they best be ready to see what it means when a man stands his ground." The tension thickened, the silence between them cut only by the wind whistling down the street. The sheriff studied him a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're forcing my hand, Amos. If they come, I can't always shield you." "I ain't asking for your shield," Amos replied. "I'm asking you to remember the law's meant to protect the innocent. That girl's innocent. If you let them drag her back, her blood's on your hands too." For a moment Sheriff Hale's mask cracked, his eyes flicking with something, guilt, or maybe the memory of a time when he had believed in justice more than politics. He tipped his hat slightly, not in surrender but in acknowledgement. "Do what you think you must, but know this, the widow won't let go easy. She's stirring men already. They'll come at night. They'll come hard." Amos turned without another word, his boots thudding heavy as he walked back to his horse. He didn't need the sheriff's blessing. He had made his vow already, and no man or widow's word could shake it. He swung into the saddle and rode out of town, the whispers trailing behind him like smoke. Back at the ranch, Clara waited on the porch, her small figure wrapped in the quilt, eyes wide as she watched the trail. When Amos finally appeared on the horizon, she bolted down the steps, barefoot across the cold ground, running until she nearly stumbled into his stirrup. "You came back," she breathed, clutching at his leg as he dismounted. Amos lifted her gently, setting her against his chest. "Told you I would. A promise is a promise." Her arms tightened around his neck, her face pressed into his coat. For a moment, Amos let himself breathe, let himself feel the weight of her trust. But as he carried her inside, he couldn't shake the image of the men the sheriff had warned him of, men who would come under cover of darkness, carrying not whips this time, but fire and guns. That night Amos kept the lanterns low. He walked the perimeter of the ranch with his rifle, the cold biting at his face, the silence heavy with expectation. Clara lay curled on the cot inside, but every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made her flinch. She had lived too long under fear to believe safety could last. Near midnight the first sound came, a distant rumble, faint at first, then louder. Hooves, many of them. Amos positioned himself by the fence, rifle steady in his grip, his body still as stone. The moonlight glinted off the barrels of guns as figures emerged from the tree line, shadows moving like a tide across the pasture. There were at least a dozen, maybe more. At their front rode a man Amos recognized, not just by his face but by the arrogance in his posture. Jacob Vance, a rancher whose wealth had long bought him loyalty in town, a man who believed cruelty was just another tool to keep order. Vance reined his horse at the fence, his grin sharp as a knife. "Evening, Calder. Heard you took in what wasn't yours. Thought we'd come collect." Amos raised his rifle, the barrel catching the moonlight. "She's a child, Vance. You ride on now and this ends without blood." Vance laughed, the sound ugly in the quiet night. "You talk big, Calder, but 1 man against 12. You can't win." Amos's voice was low, steady, every word like stone laid on stone. "I don't need to win. I only need to make sure none of you touch her." The standoff stretched, silence taut as a drawn bowstring. Inside the cabin, Clara crouched at the window, her small fingers clutching the sill, her breath fogging the glass. She saw the men, the guns, the fire in their eyes, and her heart pounded so loud she thought it would burst. She whispered into the quilt, her voice a fragile prayer, "Please, Lord, don't let him fall." Then without warning, Vance raised his hand. The men fanned out, rifles glinting, torches lit, the smell of pitch thick on the wind. Amos braced, his rifle cocked, his jaw set like iron. The fight for Clara's future had come. The night quivered with tension, every sound magnified, the restless stamping of horses, the crackle of torches, the faint whistle of the wind sweeping across the plain. Amos Calder stood at the fence line, his rifle steady in his hands, his boots planted firm in the dirt as if his very weight could hold back the tide of men bearing down on him. The dozen riders spread in a half circle, firelight flickering across their hard faces, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the pasture. Inside the cabin, Clara crouched by the window, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out her breath. The quilt was clutched so tightly in her fists that her knuckles had gone white, the threads threatening to tear. Her small frame trembled as she pressed her cheek to the sill, eyes wide as she stared at the lone figure who stood between her and the storm. She remembered the sting of the whip, the taste of blood in her mouth, the voices that had called her nothing more than debt. Now those same voices carried again, cruel and mocking, demanding she be given back. Only Amos stood there, a wall of silence, a man who seemed as immovable as the mountain ridges in the distance. Jacob Vance sat tall in his saddle at the front of the pack, torchlight painting his smug face with an orange glow. His voice carried sharp across the night. "Step aside, Calder. You ain't got a claim on the girl. You know the law of labor. She's bound, same as her mother before her." Amos didn't move. His rifle was raised, not wavering, his eyes locked on Vance's. His words came low, steady, and unshaken. "No law binds a child, not to a whip, not to a widow, and not to you, Vance. Turn around, take your men back, or this night ends in blood." The riders muttered, shifting in their saddles, their torches swaying in the cold wind. The fire in their hands seemed to match the fire in their hearts, restless, dangerous, ready to consume. But none dared ride forward first. They all knew Amos Calder, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, the man who had once fought in battles where only the stubborn survived. His silence, his stillness, carried more weight than shouted threats. Vance smirked, leaning slightly in his saddle. "1 man against 12. Do the math, Calder. You ain't walking away from this." Amos's grip tightened, his jaw hardening. He remembered Clara's small hand clutching his sleeve that morning, her whisper trembling like a prayer. "Don't let them take me." He had given her his word, and Amos Calder was not a man who broke his word. "You're right about the math," Amos said, his voice carrying like the crack of a whip. "But I only need 1 bullet to drop the first man who crosses this fence, and I reckon you know I don't miss." The words carved silence into the night. Even the horses seemed to pause, ears flicking nervously as if they too sensed the steel in Amos's tone. Vance's smirk faltered, if only for a moment. He tugged at his reins, his men glancing uneasily toward one another, waiting for a cue that never came. From the cabin window, Clara watched Amos's silhouette, broad and unyielding, framed by torchlight. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt a strange flicker deep in her chest. Not hope yet, but something close, something that made her whisper through trembling lips, "He won't let them, he won't." The standoff stretched into an eternity, the torches crackling louder, the air so taut it seemed one breath could shatter it. Finally, Vance broke the silence with a scoff, though his voice betrayed the unease he tried to mask. "This ain't finished, Calder. You can't hold out forever. That girl'll bring ruin to your land. Mark me." Amos lowered his rifle only slightly, just enough to show he wasn't about to fire yet. "If ruin comes," he said, "it'll come for me, but that child will never feel a lash again, not while I draw breath." Vance spat into the dirt, jerking his reins. His horse turned sharply, and with a muttered curse, he led his men back into the darkness. Their torches bobbed and dwindled as they rode off, leaving only the silence of the plain and the distant cry of a night bird. Amos stood still for long minutes after they had gone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Only when the last echo of hooves faded did he lower his rifle fully. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of what had just passed settling into his bones. He turned toward the cabin, where a pale face peeked from behind the curtain. Clara darted away from the window as he entered, her small feet scrambling across the floor. She ran straight to him, clutching his leg with both arms, pressing her face into the coarse fabric of his trousers. Her tears came hot and fast, her body trembling against him. "They were gonna take me," she sobbed. "I thought they always do." Amos knelt, setting his rifle aside and pulling her into his arms. "They didn't," he said, his voice rough but firm. "And they won't, not ever again. You're here now, Clara, and here you'll only know kindness." She clung tighter, her cries muffled against his chest. Amos closed his eyes, his chin resting against her tangled hair. He felt the rise and fall of her small body, the tremors of fear still coursing through her. And beneath it all, he felt the fragile beginnings of trust, delicate as glass, but stronger than any chain. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Amos didn't sleep. He sat at the table, his rifle within reach, watching the fire burn low. Clara eventually drifted into slumber, curled on the cot, but even in sleep her body twitched, her face contorted by memories too heavy for a child to bear. Amos's gaze lingered on her, the firelight etching shadows across his worn features. He had taken her in on a vow, but that vow had drawn a line in the dirt. Men like Vance wouldn't let the matter die. Dawn broke cold and gray. Frost clung to the fence rails and the pasture lay silent. Amos brewed coffee over the fire, the bitter steam curling into the air. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open, red and swollen from tears. She sat up slowly, blinking at the sight of him seated at the table, steady as stone. "You stayed up," she whispered. Amos gave a faint nod. Someone had to watch the fire. She looked at him a long moment, then slipped off the cot, padding across the floor. She climbed onto the chair beside him, her small frame swallowed by the quilt, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "You're not scared of them," she said quietly. Amos met her gaze, the corners of his eyes crinkling slightly. "I've lived long enough to know fear don't keep a man standing. What does is knowing who you're standing for." Clara's lips parted, her breath catching. She didn't speak, but her small hand crept across the table, resting atop his weathered fingers. He let it stay there, the silence between them heavier than words but gentler than anything she'd known in years. By midday, Amos set Clara to small tasks, gathering eggs, carrying kindling, learning the rhythms of life on the ranch. She moved hesitantly at first, always glancing toward him as if awaiting the lash. But each time she faltered, Amos's calm voice guided her, never harsh, never impatient. Slowly her steps grew steadier. Slowly the flinch faded. Yet the shadow of the night lingered. Clara caught Amos more than once standing at the fence line, scanning the horizon, his rifle slung across his back. He didn't say it, but she knew. The men would return, and next time they wouldn't ride away so easily. That evening, as the sun bled red across the plain, Clara sat beside the fire, the quilt pulled snug around her shoulders. Amos worked at the table, his knife carving wood into small, careful shapes. She watched him in silence, her voice finally breaking through the quiet. "Amos." He looked up, his brow lifting slightly. Why are you doing this? Why take me in?" Her voice trembled, her eyes brimming with the weight of a question too heavy for her years. Amos studied her a long moment, his knife pausing mid-carve. The fire crackled, filling the silence. At last he set the knife down, his voice low, steady, carrying the truth she deserved. "Because no child should bear what you have. Because kindness is the only whip I'll ever let touch you. And because," he hesitated, his throat tightening, "because I think God sent you here, not just for you, Clara, but for me too." Her eyes widened, her small hands clutching the quilt tighter. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but for the first time, they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of something she didn't yet have a name for, something that felt like belonging. She whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to leave." Amos reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "Then you don't. This is your home now." The words wrapped around her like the quilt itself, a promise thicker than walls, stronger than locks. But as the night deepened, both Amos and Clara knew the peace was fragile. Somewhere out there, Jacob Vance and his men were planning, waiting, preparing for the storm to return. And when it did, it would test not just Amos's vow, but the very bond that had begun to form between a broken child and the rancher who had promised her kindness. The next days unfolded like the calm before a storm, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but unsettles. Amos Calder knew it in his bones. He'd lived too many years under skies that looked gentle only to split open with thunder when a man least expected it. Jacob Vance had been pushed back once, but men like him never took insult and walked away. They licked their wounds, gathered their strength, and struck harder. Amos carried that knowledge with him in every step around the ranch. When he mended fence rails, his eyes swept the ridgeline. When he fed the horses, his ears stayed tuned to the faintest echo of hooves. And at night, when the fire burned low, he kept his rifle across his knees, watching the shadows stretch across the cabin walls. He had faced worse odds before. He could stomach the danger for himself. But now there was Clara. The child followed him through each day like a shadow stitched to his boots. She carried small buckets of water, scattered grain to the chickens, and even tried to help split kindling, though the axe was twice her size and near toppled her with every swing. Amos never scolded when she failed. Instead, he adjusted her grip, showed her patience. She was hungry to be useful, desperate to prove her place, as if afraid he might one day tire of her and send her back. One afternoon, as Clara tried again to balance a bucket nearly bigger than her arms, Amos knelt beside her. His voice was low, steady. "Clara, you don't have to work yourself near breaking to stay here. You hear me? This is your home now, no matter if you carry a bucket or not." She froze, water sloshing over her small boots, her eyes darting up to his. "But if I don't work, they'll say I don't deserve food, that I'm lazy, that I'm no good." Her words carried the echo of the widow's sharp tongue, the lashes that had followed each mistake. Amos felt the sting of them as though they were new scars across his own back. He set the bucket down gently and rested a broad hand against her shoulder. "You deserve food because you're a child. You deserve safety because you're alive. You don't earn kindness, Clara. You're owed it." The words landed like stones dropping into water. She stared at him, lips trembling as if she wanted to believe but had never heard such things before. Slowly, she nodded, her throat working as tears threatened. Amos gave her shoulder a small squeeze, then rose and carried the bucket himself. She trailed behind, her steps lighter, though her eyes still carried the weight of disbelief. That night Clara sat by the hearth, wrapped in her quilt as Amos carved wood at the table. She watched his hands work, shaving curls of pine that fell like feathers onto the floor. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice hesitant. "What are you making?" He lifted the shape. It was rough still, but the outline of a horse was emerging. "Something for you. Thought maybe you'd like a friend that don't scare easy." Her breath caught. She pressed the quilt to her face, blinking back tears. "No one ever made me anything before." Amos's eyes softened, though his voice stayed gruff. "First time for everything." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that glowed through the cracks of all her scars. Amos tucked that sight away in his memory, a treasure more valuable than gold. But peace was never meant to linger. On the fourth evening, as the sun bled red against the horizon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Amos stiffened at once, his hand resting against the rifle leaned near the door. Clara froze, her small body rigid, her eyes wide with the memory of the last night riders had come. This time it wasn't a gang. It was one man alone. As he descended the slope, Amos recognized him, Sheriff Hale. The lawman's face was drawn, his jaw set, his eyes carrying the weight of something more than casual business. Amos stepped out onto the porch, Clara clutching the doorframe behind him. The sheriff dismounted, his boots crunching on the frost, his gaze flicking toward the child before settling on Amos. "We need to talk," Hale said. Amos folded his arms, his voice steady but sharp. "Then speak it plain." Hale shifted uncomfortably, his hat in his hands. "Vance is stirring men. He's not letting this rest. Word is he's calling in favors, men from across the valley. They're planning to come down hard, burn you out if they have to." Clara gasped softly behind the door, her small fingers tightening around the wood until her knuckles turned white. Amos's jaw tightened, but his face didn't flinch. "Let them try," he said. The sheriff sighed, his voice dropping lower. "Amos, you know I don't turn a blind eye easy, but Vance has deep pockets, deep enough to sway the council. If this comes to blood, they'll call you outlaw, not him." Amos stepped down from the porch, his presence looming larger as he closed the space. "I've been called worse, but I won't hand over a child to save my own skin. Not now, not ever." Hale's eyes searched his, a storm of conflict in them. At last he nodded slowly, as if conceding to a truth he couldn't change. "Then you best be ready. When Vance comes again, it won't just be torches. He'll bring enough guns to make the earth shake." Amos gave a short nod, his voice flat as stone. "Then I'll stand until it shakes." The sheriff lingered, his eyes drifting toward Clara once more. She shrank behind the doorframe, her breath shallow. For a moment, Hale's face softened, guilt flickering in his eyes. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into the dusk. Amos watched him vanish, then returned inside. Clara looked up at him, her face pale. "They're going to burn us," she whispered. He crouched, setting his large hands on her trembling shoulders. His voice was firm, unwavering. "They may burn the house, Clara, they may burn the barn, but they'll never touch you, not while I breathe." Her tears spilled over, her small body collapsing into his arms. Amos held her close, his heart pounding with the weight of what was coming. He had built his life on solitude, on silence. But now, for the first time in years, he had something worth standing, fighting, and bleeding for. That night Amos prepared. He checked every rifle, every round of ammunition, every tool that could be turned to defense. He boarded windows, reinforced doors, and stacked water barrels close to the cabin walls. Clara watched silently, her quilt pulled tight around her. She wanted to help, but Amos sent her to rest. When at last the cabin quieted, Amos sat at the table, the carved wooden horse resting unfinished beside him. His eyes lingered on it, then shifted to Clara's sleeping form. He whispered into the silence, the words carrying like a prayer. "She'll only know kindness here, Lord, but I'll need your strength to keep her safe." The fire burned low. Outside, the land was silent, too silent. Somewhere beyond the ridges, men were gathering, their anger growing, their torches ready. Amos knew they would come soon. And when they did, the ranch would become a battlefield, not for land or pride, but for the soul of a child who had already suffered enough. The days bled into one another, each sunrise painting the sky in gray warning rather than promise. Amos Calder felt it in the marrow of his bones. The storm wasn't far now. He had lived long enough to know when trouble was breathing just beyond the horizon. Jacob Vance wasn't a man to swallow humiliation. No, men like him sharpened their pride on other people's backs, and when that pride was bruised, they struck harder, crueler. Clara sensed it too. The little girl never strayed far from Amos's side, her small feet pattering after him as though he were the only solid ground left in her world. At night, she curled on the cot with her quilt clutched so tight it looked as if she feared it might vanish like all other comforts had. More than once Amos woke to find her standing by his chair, her eyes wide and glossy, whispering the same fear. "They'll come." And he would kneel, steady and slow, resting a calloused hand against her tangled hair. "Yes, Clara," he would murmur, "they'll come, but so long as I'm here they won't take you. Not now, not ever." The preparation became their rhythm. By day Amos worked like a man reforging his world into a fortress. He hauled water, hammered boards across weak places in the cabin, and set tools in careful reach. The barn was cleared of straw that could catch fire too easily. Trenches were dug along the fence line, shallow but wide enough to slow charging horses. Clara did what she could, though her hands were small. She carried pebbles in her pockets to wedge into cracks Amos pointed out, fetched nails from the tin box, and even held the lantern steady when the dusk pressed in and Amos still worked with hammer and saw. She never complained, never whimpered, though her eyes betrayed the gnawing fear that clung to her like a second skin. Amos's rifle barked, the shot striking the dirt near Vance's horse, scattering gravel into its flanks. The beast reared, throwing Vance sideways, his torch spiraling into the frost. The men faltered again, their leader sprawled in the dirt, his curse ringing sharp. Inside the cabin, Clara pressed her face into the quilt, her body shaking with sobs she couldn't stop. Yet even through her fear, she clutched the wooden horse tight, whispering through broken breaths, "Please, God, keep him standing, please." Amos reloaded with calm precision, his voice booming across the field. "Turn back, you won't take her. Not tonight, not ever." But rage had blinded the men now. They surged again, some swinging torches toward the barn, others shouting to surround the cabin. Amos fired again, the crack echoing off the hills. One rider's torch fell from his hand, sputtering in the dirt. Another cursed, his horse refusing to push through the fence trench Amos had dug. The battle had begun, but Amos Calder stood like a stone against the tide. Each shot he placed was not reckless but precise, not meant for slaughter but for warning, for scattering. Yet he knew, deep in his chest, that warning would not hold forever. The men pressed harder, their torches closing in. The smell of pitch thickened, smoke rising where fire kissed the barn's thatched roof. Amos's heart pounded as he swung his aim toward the flame. He fired, the shot striking the torchbearer's arm. The man screamed, dropping the brand before it could spread. The others faltered again, fear finally creeping into their bravado. Still they circled, restless, dangerous, unwilling to admit defeat. Amos's breaths came hard, his rifle hot in his hands, but his eyes burned with a fire that matched theirs. Inside, Clara crawled to the window, peeking through the crack of the boards Amos had nailed tight. She saw the torches, the angry faces, the barn smoldering faintly, and her heart clenched. She pressed the wooden horse to her lips, whispering again and again, "He promised, he promised." Outside, Jacob Vance staggered to his feet, his pride bloodied but not broken. His eyes burned with hatred as he pointed a shaking finger toward Amos. "You'll regret this, Calder. You can't hold forever. We'll see you buried with that stray girl clinging to your bones." Amos raised his rifle, his voice thunderous. "Better a grave with honor than a life spent lashing children. You hear me, Vance? This ends with me standing, or not at all." The night crackled with the weight of it. Fire smoldered, men snarled, horses stamped, and the earth itself seemed to wait for the next move. Clara's heart hammered, her tears hot against her cheeks, as she watched the man who had become her shield face down a dozen with nothing but grit and a rifle. And in that moment, the child who had once whispered, "whipped," like Mama was, found herself whispering something else entirely, words of fragile hope, words she had never dared before. "He's mine now, my family." The night pressed down like a beast, thick with smoke and the stench of sweat and pitch. Men circled, their torches casting the ranch in a hellish glow, shadows of horses leaping and twisting across the ground. Amos Calder stood at the fence line, broad-shouldered and unyielding, the barrel of his rifle gleaming cold under the torchlight. Behind him, the cabin loomed small but steady, its shuttered windows hiding a trembling child whose prayers rose soft and desperate into the dark. Jacob Vance spat blood from his mouth, his pride stung more than his body from the tumble he'd taken. Rage flickered in his eyes like the flames in his men's hands. "You think you can stand against us, Calder? One man. You ain't saving her, you're damning yourself." Amos's voice cut across the pasture, iron and steady. "Then let it be me that's damned, but I'll not hand over a child to wolves." Vance snarled, raising his arm, "Burn it." The order cracked like a whip. 2 riders broke forward, torches arcing through the night as they hurled them toward the barn. Flame licked up dry boards, hungry and quick. The horses in the corral reared and screamed, eyes rolling white in terror. Clara's muffled cry rang from inside the cabin. Amos didn't flinch. He pivoted, his rifle barking once, twice. One torch dropped smoldering into the dirt. The other clattered harmlessly against the trench he had dug, flames sputtering out in the damp soil. The men cursed, reeling their horses back, but Vance's howl rose above them all. "Take him! Take the house!" They surged. Hooves thundered, torches swung, rifles leveled. Amos stood like stone, his rifle cracking rhythm into the chaos. A horse stumbled at the trench, throwing its rider into the dirt. Another cursed as a shot tore his hat clean off, the bullet grazing hair instead of skull. Amos didn't fire blind. Every shot was placed to scatter, to wound, to frighten. Killing was a last resort, but protecting was not. The tide pressed harder. A torch struck the barn roof, flame blooming across the dry thatch. The horses screamed louder, the heat rising. Amos gritted his teeth, his chest pounding. He couldn't save everything. Not the barn, not the hay. Tonight he could only save the child. "Clara," he bellowed toward the cabin, "stay down." She crouched low on the cot, the little wooden horse clutched to her chest, her body trembling. Smoke seeped through the cracks, stinging her eyes. She pressed her face into the quilt, whispering broken words. "Please, God, don't let him fall. Please don't." Outside, Amos reloaded, his movements smooth, his eyes locked on Vance, who had pushed his horse close now, pistol drawn, his men gathering courage behind him. "You can't win, Calder," Vance shouted over the roar of fire. "Hand her over and maybe we'll leave you standing." Amos raised his rifle, his voice steady as steel. "I'll die first." Vance's grin was sharp, ugly. "Then you will." He spurred his horse forward, pistol leveled, his men crying out in a surge of fury. Time seemed to slow. Amos's breath steadied. He thought of Clara's sob when he first lifted her from the dirt, her whisper, whipped like Mama was, and the vow he had spoken over her trembling shoulders. "You'll only know kindness here." His rifle barked. Vance's pistol went spinning from his hand, clattering uselessly into the dirt. His horse reared, throwing him sideways once again, his pride spilling into the dust with him. The men faltered. Their leader lay groaning in the dirt, his weapon gone, his arrogance scattered. The fire roared at the barn, but the cabin still stood, unbroken, the man at its fence line unyielding. The riders glanced at one another, mutters rising, fear twisting through their anger. Amos leveled his rifle again, his voice thundering. "Go on then, burn what you will, but step one boot closer to this cabin and you'll never ride home." The men hesitated. Firelight danced in their eyes, but their courage wavered. One spat, turning his horse. Another followed, muttering curses. Soon the tide turned, horses wheeling, torches thrown into the dirt. The riders scattered, leaving only Jacob Vance crawling in the dust, his pride broken, his men abandoning him. Amos lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with long, steady breaths. He didn't move until the last echo of hooves faded over the ridge. Then and only then did he step back toward the cabin. The barn blazed, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. He watched a moment, jaw tight, then turned away. Some things could be rebuilt. Others couldn't. Tonight he had saved what mattered most. He pushed the cabin door open. Smoke swirled, the firelight casting wild shadows. Clara scrambled from the cot, the wooden horse clutched tight, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Amos," she cried, throwing herself into his arms. He caught her, lifting her easily, her small arms locking around his neck. She buried her face against his chest, sobs breaking free, shaking her thin body. I thought they'd kill you." Amos held her close, his rough hand cradling the back of her head. His voice was low, firm, steady as stone. "I told you, Clara, not while I breathe." She clung tighter, her tears wetting his shirt. He closed his eyes, the weight of the night settling heavy in his bones, but beneath it all, a strange peace flickered. The barn smoldered, the ranch scarred, but the child in his arms was safe, and that made every loss worth bearing. For days after, the smoke lingered over the land, a reminder of what had been tried and failed. Word spread quick through the valley, how Amos Calder had stood alone against Jacob Vance and a dozen men, how he had not given an inch, how the widow's claim had crumbled under the weight of his defiance. Some whispered he was a fool, others that he was dangerous, but Clara heard only one truth, whispered into her hair in the quiet of that night. She would never know the whip again. The sheriff came days later, his face drawn. He found Amos repairing the fence, Clara perched on a rail beside him, her small hands feeding scraps to a curious chicken. The lawman dismounted, his eyes scanning the charred ruins of the barn, the scorch marks in the dirt, before resting on the child. "She yours now?" Hale asked quietly. Amos looked up, his jaw firm. "She's mine to protect, that enough for you?" The sheriff studied him a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Reckon it is. Town's talking. Vance won't show his face soon. You may have bought her peace." Clara looked up at Amos, her eyes wide, searching. He ruffled her hair gently, his voice low. "Not bought, Sheriff, promised." And with that, Amos turned back to the fence, the hammer steady in his hand, the child safe at his side. For the first time in her life, Clara knew what it meant to belong, not as property, not as burden, but as family. The barn would be rebuilt. The whispers of men would fade. But the vow spoken that night, forged in fire and smoke, would outlast them all. Clara would never be whipped again. She would only know kindness.